The Interstate 10 corridor between Tucson and Phoenix provides access to many communities. It's a region that's referred to as the Sun Corridor. The entire Sun Corridor is expected to experience robust growth over the next 25 years. This growth will increase the demands on the regional transportation system. In order to continue to provide a safe, effective, and efficient transportation system, the Arizona Department of Transportation is studying ways to meet this projected travel demand. Whether commuting to work daily within the Sun Corridor or driving on I-10 between Tucson and Phoenix for business, pleasure, or to get to the airport, travelers can expect increased congestion. Currently, the trip between Tucson and Phoenix on I-10 takes under 2 hours. Imagine this highway, now at 6 lanes in most locations, widened to 8 lanes. Over the next few decades, even with 8 lanes, it will take nearly 3 hours to make this same trip. As communities in the Sun Corridor grow, local commuter trip times are expected to increase as well. This expected growth in travel demand, combined with constraints on how much we can reasonably expect to expand the existing road network, creates the need to consider different transportation options.
I'm Mike Keys, Assistant Director for ADOT's Multimodal Planning Division.
And I'm Carlos Lopez with ADOT's Rail Planning Program.
The Arizona Department of Transportation is considering transportation options beyond roadways to help meet expected growth in Pima, Pinal, and Maricopa counties. Previous statewide and regional planning efforts identified passenger rail that could travel at speeds of up to 125 miles an hour as a viable option. To explore this option, in 2011, ADOT initiated the Arizona Passenger Rail Corridor Study that is led by the Federal Railroad Administration, also known as FRA.
An important component of this study is the development of a draft Tier 1 Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. It documents the environmental considerations related to this mode of travel and the proposed routes. The purpose of this video is to provide you with an overview of the technical and environmental analysis, as well as public feedback received to date and the recommendations.
This information will enable you to provide comments that will help shape the transportation vision between Tucson and Phoenix.
There is a lot of public support for transportation alternatives between Tucson and Phoenix. In fact, during the kickoff of this project, more than 2,400 Arizonans weighed in on the passenger rail corridor study, with 59% indicating they would prefer reducing traffic congestion through improvements to public transportation. The passenger rail study recommendations are based on 3 key components: technical and environmental analysis, public and stakeholder input, and government agency input. Understanding the input from these 3 sources is essential to addressing future transportation needs and expectations along this 120-mile corridor. Potential corridor options are identified in 2 complementary studies: an alternatives analysis and a high-level environmental study called a Tier 1 Environmental Impact Statement, or Tier 1 EIS. The alternatives analysis developed concepts of different alternative corridors for cost estimating, operational analysis, and to identify potential benefits or impacts resulting from implementing such a system. A Tier 1 EIS is a high-level analysis of the built, social, and natural environments enabling potential environmental effects to be compared between the 2 alternatives being considered and to a no-build alternative. Under the no-build alternative, no passenger rail system would be constructed between Tucson and Phoenix. The no-build assumes all existing facilities and all committed projects within the study corridor would occur. Committed projects include all transportation facilities programmed for implementation. These projects would include the planned extensions of Valley Metro Light Rail and improvements along I-10. The Tier 1 EIS included analysis of the potential effects of a passenger rail system on a wide variety of environmental resources, such as parks, wildlife and recreation areas, along with noise, air quality, threatened and endangered species, historic properties, and waterways. Throughout the process that led to the recommendations documented in the Tier 1 EIS, ADOT met with communities within the corridor, seeking input from community members, businesses, local governments, and other stakeholders through a series of public outreach events. More than 10,000 surveys and thousands of comments were received between 2012 and 2014. There were several phases in this study. ADOT identified a range of alternatives which included 150 potential routes in the corridor. Then we did a very high-level evaluation to narrow the field to 7 reasonable and representative alternatives. There was also a more detailed analysis that narrowed it down to 2 final alternatives and a no-build alternative. More information, including an environmental review, is documented in the Tier 1 EIS and the Alternatives Analysis Report. The final 2 alternatives have 2 common corridors identified by the brown swath. The Southern Common Corridor is from Eloy through downtown Tucson to the Tucson International Airport. The Northern Common Corridor runs from Tempe through Phoenix and to the West Valley towards Buckeye and to the northwest towards Surprise. The 2 alternatives differ in Pinal County and in eastern Maricopa County. Starting in Eloy going north, the yellow corridor alternative follows the existing railroad corridor from Eloy towards Phoenix. The yellow corridor alternative goes through Coolidge, Santan Valley, Queen Creek, Gilbert, Mesa, and Tempe until it links to the Northern Common Corridor along the rail corridor from Tempe to Phoenix. Starting in Eloy going north, the orange corridor alternative follows a planned multimodal corridor known as the North-South Corridor near Florence, Apache Junction, and East Mesa. In East Mesa, the orange corridor alternative follows existing highway facilities such as US 60, Loop 101, and Loop 202 in Tempe until it too links with the Northern Common Corridor from Tempe to Phoenix. It is important to note that the environmental analysis covered the corridors between downtown Tucson and downtown Phoenix. The corridors south of Tucson and west of Phoenix were carried forward as part of the passenger rail vision. However, these are not covered in the environmental analysis and will be analyzed in future studies. The final alternatives were further evaluated in the EIS for many factors, including ridership, environmental considerations, technical data, transportation effects, and cost. Since the Tier 1 EIS is a high-level study, it considers mile-wide corridors. At this level of study, the potential environmental impacts for each corridor were comparable with one notable exception. There is greater potential for loss of habitat acreage to new right-of-way within the orange corridor alternative. The passenger rail service concept within these 2 alternative corridors assumed maximum train operating speed of 125 miles per hour and a blend of intercity and commuter service using the same corridor between Tucson and Phoenix. The intercity rail component can be characterized as an express trip that would skip stations to reach high-activity centers such as airports or major downtown areas. The commuter rail trip includes the local trips that provide access to all stations, which are typically spaced between 5 and 10 miles apart. Service assumptions were developed to estimate the number of riders and how a rail system could provide a feasible alternative to automobile travel. The yellow alternative is expected to carry more riders than the orange alternative because it would provide more direct access to established communities along its proposed route. ADOT also evaluated the financial feasibility of a passenger rail system. Capital cost estimates for the full 120-mile corridor include new railroad track, bridge structures, and a signal system. In addition, the cost estimates include the annual operating and maintenance for both intercity and commuter rail. These cost estimates were based on current and similar rail operations located in other areas of the western United States. The team compared cost estimates based on general alignments assumed for the yellow and orange alternatives. Though no specific passenger rail technology has been selected, cost estimates were based on diesel-powered trains capable of traveling comfortably at 125 miles per hour. The capital cost estimates range from $4.2 to $5.1 billion for a passenger rail system within the yellow corridor alternative, and $6.8 to $8.4 billion within the orange corridor alternative. Considering overall estimated costs, public input, projected ridership, and potential environmental effects associated with implementing passenger rail, the yellow corridor alternative is considered to be more cost-efficient and better performing than a system within the orange corridor alternative. Therefore, ADOT has recommended to the Federal Railroad Administration the yellow corridor alternative as the preferred alternative. It is important to note that the Tier 1 EIS was not detailed enough to differentiate between the final alternatives in Tempe and Pinal County, so options in these areas would be carried forward in future environmental studies. This study concludes that passenger rail between Tucson and Phoenix is a feasible alternative mode of travel. It recommends the yellow corridor alternative as the most appropriate corridor to focus future efforts towards implementation. The next stop in the passenger rail study process is to advance the preferred corridor for more detailed environmental study. However, no reasonable source of funding has been identified at this point to continue passenger rail development, design, or construction. Sources of funding can include public, private, or a mix of both. It will be up to members of the public, policymakers, the business community, and stakeholders who will need to continue to discuss and identify sources of funding before the concept can move forward beyond the point we are at today. Your input on this draft Tier 1 environmental impact statement will help shape the vision for passenger rail between Tucson and Phoenix. After the public review period, public input, and addressing any comments received, the FRA will make a final decision and select a preferred alternative. In the future, if funding becomes available, a specific alignment would be identified within the preferred alternative corridor, and a Tier 2 environmental analysis would be undertaken to fully explore environmental effects and the need to avoid or mitigate them. The recommendations provide for a passenger rail system that can be constructed and operated in phases, which would allow the system to be funded incrementally. The specific phasing of a future passenger rail system is not known at this time, but would be determined as funding is allocated to the project.
Thank you for your interest and participation in this process. Passenger rail provides the opportunity to support our economy and connect population centers. Your recommendations have the potential to improve mobility, connectivity, and provide dependable travel in the region while significantly enhancing Arizona's future. For more detailed information, please view a copy of the draft Tier 1 EIS online at azdot.gov/passengerrail.